Whoever you are and wherever you are upon life's journey, we are glad you have joined us. Stay tuned for Reach Out and Live. Welcome to Reach Out and Live, a program of music, scripture, and sermon brought to you each week by the many viewers and members of First-Plymouth Church, Lincoln, Nebraska. Hi, my name's Jim, minister here at First-Plymouth. You have decided to join us today. That is an intention upon your heart, and that intention to love God and to love others, that will do us all well. So the congregation is ready. Let's join them.
How do you tell a story about failure? And I mean an epic fail. Aaron blows it completely. And there's no contrition. It's not a story of redemption, really. He blows it, but then just goes on to be a biblical hero. Life isn't any easy equation. Aaron was the middle child. And when you're the middle child, you can struggle for recognition to stand out. But he wasn't just the middle child, he was surrounded by greatness. His younger brother was Moses. His older sister was Miriam, the prophetess of lore, the leader of men. How is Aaron going to stand out? What was it like growing up with that sister and that brother? Well, it wasn't just growing up in their shadow. If you remember, Moses got to grow up in the Pharaoh's court, grow up in royalty. Aaron actually grew up in the hinterlands of Egypt, the southwest corner. He was always in their shadow. But then came his chance to finally shine. Because God had just called Moses, his brother, to go set the Hebrew slaves free. But do you remember when God asks Moses to do that, Moses says, "No way. I'm not good enough." Moses totally chickened out. Do you remember this? He said, I can't speak well. I can't do that. And God seems so frustrated that Moses wouldn't cowboy up, that God says, "Okay, I'll give you your brother Aaron to be your mouthpiece. I'll give you some help." So then it's Moses and Aaron that are going to the Pharaoh saying, "Let my people go." It wasn't just Moses. It was very much Moses and Aaron. And Aaron was taking a lead. It was Aaron's staff that turned into a snake to impress the Pharaoh. It was Aaron's staff that caused the plagues of gnats and flies. It was Aaron that was showing equal power. It was Moses and Aaron coming at the Pharaoh, and finally the Pharaoh relented and let the Hebrews leave. But do you remember the Pharaoh changed his mind, marshaled all the armies, and they start to chase the Hebrews. The Hebrews end up at the Red Sea. They're blocked off. They're going to face catastrophe. And then Moses stretched out his hand and parted the Red Sea. Here's where it changes. Up until then, it had always been Moses and Aaron in these scenes. But suddenly, it's not Aaron's staff. It's not even Aaron at all. Moses extends his arm. The sea parts. The Hebrews escape, and the waters close back in on Pharaoh's armies. At that moment, Aaron becomes subservient again. Is he ever going to have a chance to shine? The rest of the way now, it's Moses who is clearly the leader. They go into the desert. They make their way to the mountain of God, to Mount Sinai. And at first, Moses and Aaron go up the mountain, but then God says, "No, Aaron, you stay down below. Moses and Joshua get to come up here now." Oh, it's changed. Aaron is second fiddle now. So Aaron is down with the people while Moses is on the top of the mountain, and Moses doesn't come back. Day after day, Moses doesn't come back down the mountain, and the people begin to wonder, what's happened to him? Are we left alone? The people begin to panic. What are we going to do? Who's going to take care of us? And Aaron starts to feel the pressure, and whether it's because of his insecurity and being that middle child, and Moses always being the lead now, and he thinks he has to do something. And so Aaron says, "Give me your jewelry. Give me your bracelets and your earrings." And Aaron melts them down in the fire. And he takes a tool and then he fashions the gold into a golden calf. And he says, "This is what we'll worship." And they forget about their God. They forget about their story. And they think Moses isn't coming back. And they start to worship this idol. And Aaron sets up an altar. And after worshiping, they all go crazy. I mean, some groups go crazy, right? They're just going nuts. And right at that moment, Moses comes down the mountain. Says, "What have you done? What are you doing? Have you forgotten God?" And Aaron totally doesn't own up to it. He goes, "Well, I don't know. We just threw the gold in the fire and it popped out a calf." He doesn't take any responsibility. This is an almost perfect failure. But then Aaron, he didn't know this, but at the very moment he was making that golden calf, up on the mountain, God was telling Moses, Aaron will become the head of the priesthood. Aaron will become the very lineage of the priesthood in the holy nation of Israel. He didn't know that even when he was making that calf. And Aaron would go on as God decreed, go on to become the head of the priesthood. How is this possible? How does a failure of that magnitude becomes something else. What kind of story is this?
If we were to rename these stories, week 1 will be something like The Tenacious Friends. Week 2, we might call it The Prodigal God. Week 3, we might call it The Despairing Prophet. Today, I would call it The Incompetent Priest and a Stiff-Necked People. And I have to admit that I kind of connect with incompetent priesthood. I've had my own moments of incompetence as a leader. And anyone in leadership knows that you have also. Now, I have a special heart for religious leadership, and I'm a little geeky about it. I love shows that portray religious leadership. I love to watch them and then critique them. Go like, there's no way a pastor would ever do that. Also critique the theology, going like, well, there's no way, that's not theologically correct. Recently, I've been into Father Brown from the BBC. Not because I want to be a, pastor who solves murders, although that would be kind of cool. But because I love, it's one of the few shows I've watched where they get a sense of pastoral life that it's so on it. The rhythms of leadership, the theological struggles, the real encounters with people. So I get Aaron. I can almost feel in my bones how he was feeling. I have a visceral response to this text because I've been in that place in leadership where the heat has been turned on, where things are not going like they should, and people demanding answers. I understand what it's like to kind of not know exactly what's going on and not know what to do, but people are demanding things and giving you ideas about things. And I can even imagine the first few days were not a huge ordeal, but once the days started stacking up on each other, Aaron was really in a position that he almost could not win. The pressure was too much. A few days ago, Facebook Memories gifted me with a picture of me about 6 years ago. The photographer was a member of the congregation who gifted us with pictures of worship each week. And he just roamed the congregation during the different worship services and took snapshots of life together. And on this day, he came behind me. Ooh, I almost killed myself there. He came behind me and took a snapshot. And I looked very pensive. It was a few minutes before I was to preach. For the average observer, they would think, oh, Pastor Juan Carlos is getting his heart prepared for worship. What he didn't know was that he took a snapshot of the worst day in my pastoral life. That moment that he took a snapshot on was the moment when I was wondering deep within my soul whether I had an enemy to proclaim good news on that day. In that very moment that he took that snapshot, what was running through my mind was, I think that I'm not ready to preach the good news on this day. I just want to run away and never return to this vocation. In that moment, when he took that snapshot, what was running through my mind were all the letters and all the threats and all the mess that I find myself in, some of it out of my own making. In that very moment, what he didn't know was that just minutes before this worship service began, one of the antagonists in my congregation swore that I would not spend another Sunday as a pastor of that church. In that very moment, I too wanted to craft an image and just give the people what they wanted. Oh, I get Aaron. And if you've been in leadership here, whether you've been in leadership in your business, or whether you've been in leadership in your family, or whether you've been in leadership in the church, or whether you've been in leadership in a civic group, you know those moments of leadership. I also understand the people. I get it. Their leader had been up for so long, and they were getting a little desperate. They were in the middle of a wilderness. Things were not looking very good. The miracle worker, Moses, who constantly was praying to God for water and food and all the things they needed, was no longer there. And they began to wonder, well, what are we going to do? And it's typical of any community, whether you're talking about a neighborhood or a city or a church or a family, that when anxiety and fear rise, we too wonder, what are we going to do? And often what we think we want is not what we need at all. This is why often as a pastor, when someone sits in my office in the middle of a crisis, I say something like this: never make a life-altering decision in the middle of a crisis. Because we're not at our best. So this community was not at its best. They were just desperate for something, so they looked to their leader for an answer. But because the leader himself was not at his best, chaos ensued. So then I begin to imagine what would have made it differently. One of my favorite writers, Gordon Lathrop, he's a liturgical theologian. He says that priests, pastors, have only a few tools at their disposal in the exercise of priesthood. They have the story of faith. They have cup. They have bread. They have water. And they have oil for anointing. Those are the only tools that we have to exercise this priestly work. So it got me thinking, in light of our own life and circumstance, what about those tools for all of us? See, we are part of a Protestant tradition that has taken great pride in understanding called the priesthood of all believers. That means that all of us, yes, for sure, have an opportunity. We often say it like this. We often say, well, it's that we don't need a mediator to reach God. And that's partially true. In other words, God doesn't need a mediator to reach us. But I began to think, in priesthood, part of what we do is we do mediate. God doesn't need mediation, but often we need mediation. And here's what came to mind. When I was a child and I needed something, I would often know which parent I needed to go to get what I wanted. So depending on what my spiel was, I would go to mom or dad. You know, you learn the personalities, you know who's going to get you what. So I would play the little game there. And the game was really a lot of fun until I became a parent. But there were those moments, though, when even though I thought I had read the room right, Dad would say, no. So then I would go to Mom. Now, I knew the answer. I knew Mom would say, what did your dad say? And I would have to admit, well, Dad said no. But often Mom would let me give her my spiel anyway. And so I would plead my case. And though it didn't happen very often, I was amazed at times that in the next 24-hour cycle, something amazing would happen. Dad would change his mind. I don't know what kind of magic my mother would utilize, but she would mediate on my behalf. See, in our lives with God, it's true. God doesn't need us to have mediators, but we often need mediators. And that's why we have a priesthood of all believers. We who are gathered here, we truly mediate for one another. So imagine what a different story this would have been if Aaron, in the midst of his struggles and in the midst of his sense of self that was a little kind of off, in the middle of his insecurities, in the middle of the reality of his circumstance, he would have just engaged the community and used the tools that he had at his disposal. He would remind them of their shared story. He would remind them that not too long before, they had seen the Red Sea parting so that they could have a way. He would have reminded them that not too long before, they had been slaves in Egypt, and yet God freed them into a promised land. They would have been reminded that in spite of all their hunger and their thirst, that every single crisis moment, God had been there providing for every single need. They would have been reminded that as they were standing there desperate and wondering that they could still see the cloud of God's presence up the mountain, they would have been reminded that there was no need to create other gods. The temptation is there for sure. And before we get too judgy about these Israelites, we too love to create our own gods. Oh, they might not have the shape of a Baal, or we might even get a little iffy about statues, but the reality of it is that humans have a penchant for creating gods so that we can have deities that we can control. Deities that agree with us, deities that give us exactly what we think we need, deities that will give us the answers that we prefer, deities that look a lot like us and who like the people we like and dislike the people we dislike. And so it's a lot easier to create deities than it is to remember that at the end of the day, the one true God of love and acceptance and new life, that is the God who is with us in this very moment, in the midst of our uncertainty, in the midst of our struggle, in the midst of our questions, in the midst of our trials and tribulations. And I'm wondering today, as we're gathered for worship, you priest, you people of God, are we being called to minister to one another, to remind each other of the story? Because I know as we're gathered here for worship, in the midst of the hymns we sing and the prayers we say, in the midst of the attentive listening that we are doing, so many of us are gathered here knowing the struggles of our own hearts. Many of us questioning and wondering, will God be faithful this time? Many of us having doubts about our own exercise of leadership, about our own ways in which the decisions we have to make tomorrow or this afternoon. Many of us are finding ourselves in the place that the Israelites found themselves, and we have a decision to make. Are we going to allow that stuff to guide our decision making and our next steps, or are we going to call upon the God that has been faithful all along? The God of community, the God of story, the God of grace, the God of new life, the miracle worker, the God whose love has been sufficient before. People of God, I'm so glad for a story about incompetent priesthood and stiff-necked people. That's us. That is us. And I'm so glad of the story of a God who, in spite of our mess-ups, continues to guide us to our journey into the promised land. Thanks be to God. Amen.
I will lift up mine eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. Shall preserve thee from evil. The Lord shall preserve thy soul.
I am so glad we could worship together, and I hope you feel uplifted. Do you know you could join our worship services live every Sunday morning at 9 and 10:30 on Facebook, YouTube, or our website? And all of that is made possible by friends like you.
If you believe that an open-minded, loving congregation can help change the world, then consider making a donation. It will help us increase the love of God and neighbor, both in Nebraska and the world. If you would like to learn more about our church, go to firstplymouth.org. You can watch videos of the sermons, learn about our many programs and missions, then follow us to Facebook and become a friend.
We now worship online at 9 a.m. and 10:30 on YouTube, Facebook, Vimeo, and our website. We also add live events, so join us online. And so we have worshiped together. We have nurtured our souls. So this week, return no one evil for evil. Hold fast to what is good and reach out and live.
Tune in again next week for another edition of Reach Out and Live.